Hi, it's Ritch Esra from MUBUTV, where our mission is to educate, empower, and engage your music career. We're coming to you from Musexpo here in Burbank, where we managed to catch up with legendary A&R man and founder of Mom+Pop Music, the one and only Michael Goldstone. Michael, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for joining us. You know, your work in music began in high school, and I'm curious, is this when you knew that music was going to be your professional career path?
I believe so. I mean, for me, I had been going to shows, sneaking in since I was, 14, 15, 16 years old, whether it was clubs, if I could sneak in, or whether it was, shows that were happening at the Santa Monica Civic or the Roxy or the Whiskey or wherever it was. So for me, that last year of high school, was, really getting through it to get to a point where, to be frank, I was, had the opportunity to continue in music with a job at Chrysalis, or I had the chance to go to college. And at that point, I made a really sort of intuitive decision to, stick with music. I knew I wanted to do it. I was passionate about it. And pragmatically, I did not want to be going to college and looking for the same job 4 years later that I had in that moment. And I was instinctive enough to say, this is an opportunity and I'm not going to let it go.
Okay. You said early in your career that A&R was never a job that you felt you were qualified for. And, when I read that, I'm just curious, what gave you the confidence to take your first A&R job?
Well, it's an interesting question because, at that moment in time, my experience was in marketing and PR. And, Steve Moyer had come to me and said, I want you to do A&R. I guess at the time I had tipped him to, hey, you should check into this band Motley Crue. Hey, I was reading about this band in Excess. And, he had the instinct and intuition to sort of throw me into it. And, my sort of response was, I don't play. I'm not an engineer. I'm not a producer. I can't sit there and tell musicians what chords to pivot to. And, he sort of shared in a blunt way of, always take a job you're not ready for. You will figure it out. You will learn how to do it. And he was visionary for me in some ways, because I learned very quickly to sort of compensate for those skills and be able to communicate with musicians.
That's funny, because that's what I was going to ask you is, what were the skills that you picked up that helped you refine your, I guess, A&R skills at the beginning? What did you learn from that first experience that you ended up taking with you in terms of your career, A&R wise?
I think that it was the first two records I ever made. One was Charlie Sexton, one was a band called Broken Homes, which you might remember.
I do. I remember both of them very well, and I remember the impact that Charlie had and how he was like, the press went crazy over him. Here is this like wonderkind of 18 years old, or 16, I think.
I think it was 15 when we signed him.
Yeah,
and
unbelievable.
And it's wonderful that he's still touring with Bob Dylan and playing shows and doing music. It makes me really happy that he's still doing it.
Yes, great. A master musician, and I remember Broken Homes.
Yeah, that one, didn't sort of have the commercial impact, and that wasn't necessarily the lesson that I learned so much, but it was the difference in sort of realizing that different artists need different level of participation and engagement. And so when you make a first record and you don't really know what you're doing, you think, okay, this is the process. And then you work with a completely different set of musicians on the second record, and you learn really quickly that how you approach the first one has nothing to do with how you can be valuable the second time around. And I learned at that moment in time that every one of those situations was going to be nuanced and different. And I also learned, a number of things that were super valuable. This was a moment in time where A&Rs were a lot more empowered around artists than they are now, and probably should have been then. And we can talk about when and how that changed. But there were things that I learned in terms of building trust, knowing when to insert myself into a conversation that was viable. I mean, Steve taught me a really valuable lesson, which was don't arm wrestle over 11 songs. Figure out the things that are most important and most impactful, and focus on the things where the intrinsic value is much more, dynamic and important, which is a long-winded way of saying, get the singles right. Don't worry about the album tracks, because you don't want to be in a dynamic with a producer or a musician where you're nitpicking at the tempo of a song that, that feels intuitive to them, that may not feel intuitive to you. And some of those lessons became really valuable that I've carried all the way through with me in terms of, the trust, and building of a relationship with an artist and a musician, and realizing that, somebody, on one hand, you can have an artist that is so driven and focused and directed that you really don't need to help them make a record. And other artists where they eventually invite you in because you haven't inserted yourself and they want to know what you think. And it's always a much better dynamic to be included by building that trust over time, and not having musicians think that you are inserting yourself into their creative process.
I don't know at what point you said this quote, but I know it wasn't at the beginning of your career, but it was a very interesting quote that you said about the A&R, your thoughts on A&R in terms of how you perceived it. You said, it's a narcissistic job. If I thought that only 80 people bought every record in my collection, then maybe I'd change my way of thinking. But I don't obsess too much about whether people will like something, so much as I wonder whether I find it compelling. It's not one of those jobs you can do by consensus. That sounds like a man who's very much more confident about the whole process, or has a deeper understanding of the A&R process than.
Well, I think that, that aspect of it, I think, was informed and probably said, after having gone through, some of the successes that I had, at Sony, with Rage Against the Machine and Pearl Jam,
right, which we'll
and getting to a point where, not at fault necessarily, but I could walk you through, if we had more time, I could walk you through, all the things, all the reasons I was given as to why neither of those bands would be successful. And decisions that they were making that were against the norm and counterintuitive to what labels thought. And, learning to sort of sit on the side of the artist, because that's how you're more valuable to your label. If you can build a relationship with that artist where they really believe that you, are not telling them to go do everything. But I think the main point that you're getting at is when you see great artistry sort of, lead as opposed to follow, you get to a point where, when you've heard everything and all the reasons, you get to a point where your innate personal taste and confidence, has to block out all that noise, because otherwise nobody would ever sign anything, and probably get in trouble back in the day. But I would never bring things into A&R meetings that I truly wanted to work with, because I didn't want to sit there with 12 people and have them tell me all the reasons why we shouldn't be doing it. And every once in a while it would, I remember, I think that quote probably came from the experience that I had with Regina Spektor at Warner Brothers, where, it was, perceived as, too left of center and not commercial and not this and not that. And she's banging her stick on a chair. And, I had to sit in a meeting with, 25 people with the sort of the main, sort of salvo being, do you really think that we should be signing this? It's kind of expensive. And a lot of people here saw the show and they weren't really moved by it. And, is this something we really should be doing? And it was such a sort of polarizing conversation that I literally said, the fact that people feel so strongly that we shouldn't be doing this is actually the reason we should be doing this. And, my boss wasn't happy about it. 6 months later, he was happy when we were sitting there at Coachella, and we ended up signing the band. Regina.
Yeah,
So,
absolutely, yes. And
but I could not have done that without the experience of having that kind of, success. And that success really brought a sort of personal freedom to not worry about being wrong.
Yeah, which I want to talk about more. You went on to take an A&R job at Polygram, which I think played a significant role in the trajectory of your A&R career. What do you remember about that time?
I think what I remember most about that time, it seemed like that was a time where things were really shifting in terms of the control from artists, from labels to artists. I remember sitting with Perry Farrell and Jane's Addiction, futilely trying to sign it to MCA before I started at Polygram because it just wasn't the right fit. And sort of hearing and learning from Perry in a way that really made me truly understand the nature of the kind of artists that I wanted to work with, the kind of artists that had a vision, that were not going to be told what to do, that had musical instincts. And in walking into the, obviously I didn't sign, Jane's Addiction, but in walking in to Mother Love Bone, it really sort of changed the way that I sort of viewed and approached the job. And had I not sort of grown in that moment as an A&R, I don't think I would have been able to sign Mother Love Bone, because they were looking for something really different in terms of what they expected that relationship to be. Two of them had been in, signed to Sub Pop and an indie band, in an indie band called Green River, and their level of understanding was so deep that it really sort of helped me learn how to change the juxtaposition in terms of what the relationship with A&R and artistry should be. Look, obviously it was a whole gamut of life and music and career. We made a record with Mother Love Bone, and it was at the time it was like right on top of or shortly after Guns N' Roses, and I believed in that moment that musically and artistically it was by far the most impactful band artistically that I had ever come across to work with. And so sadly when Andy passed, it became a sort of a life moment of really being able to sort of not get caught up with people portraying success before it happens, because you just you can't ensure or guarantee success. It's going to be the biggest band. It's going to be on the professional side it was paralyzing, and on the personal side it brought out a moment of realizing that the relationships that you have and build are so essential to hold on to. As far as you hold on to them for as long as you can, for as forever as you can. The two guys who were left in that band had no singer, no band, some demos, and I had such a deep understanding of their innate talent that we basically just said, let's just start all over again. And that led to bumping into this security guard named Eddie Vedder, and and it was a real education and resilience for them and for myself. And it was, I think without resilience, which I think sometimes is an underrated quality, I wouldn't be, might be hanging out with you, but I don't know that you'd, that I have had the opportunity to go start a record company.
Right. Absolutely, which you did. It's interesting listening to you say that, because your next job was at Epic, and that was, in reflection, a seminal time not only in your professional career, but in your culturally defining signings with Pearl Jam and Rage Against the Machine. There was a great quote that you said about that time. You said, "It was an incredible experience working at Epic, because I got the chance to move back to New York which I'd always wanted to do. I showed up with half a band, and then the Ozzy record, No More Tears, and then Pearl Jam and Rage Against the Machine. And that gave me the freedom to charge through A&R with more certainty and less fear. Can you talk about the journey of how Pearl Jam came together? Because it was a journey that you experienced with the band.
Well, I mean, I sort of alluded to it a bit, but we took, all their, their resilience and their confidence and their musicality. I remember sitting, I think at the time in Century City, parked, and Jeff, ironically, had sent me a cassette through the mail, and it was, he did all the cool art on it. It was really nifty, and it was like he sent me the new King's X record because he was a fan. It was like King's X / Ed. So there was 3 demos of songs that I'd heard with no vocals on it. I knew the tracks, and the fact that he transformed those tracks, and it was so wildly different than Mother Love Bone, artistically and musically and sonically, and turned those songs into songs that now, over time, have changed the world. I literally sobbed in my car. I really did. It was really, kind of freaky. It was, they'd only, the first person they ever auditioned, it was the only person they ever auditioned. He threw his vocals on 3 songs. Jack Irons, had gotten him the tracks, and, I thought it was my second chance.
Yeah. My God.
Yeah, because I was literally pretty close to being thrown out at that point. I was at Polygram. I hadn't, in hindsight, I think, one of my, sort of, I don't say it's a flaw necessarily, but I was not a volume signer. And so when Andy passed, I really didn't have a whole lot else going on, and company was changing, and I was pretty certain that at some point I was going to, probably lose my job.
And lo and behold, here you ended up at Epic. Now, what's so interesting is that what I remember about that album when it came out is that what made it so culturally defining for me is I remember that period so well, in that it was transformational in terms of the culture. Rock music at that time was going through that whole phase of sex, drugs, rock and roll, party, good times, and suddenly you had an album like 10. You had songs like Jeremy. You had impactful songs that were writing about things of, school shootings and people killing each other, right, and incest. I mean, it was revelatory in that this was in mainstream rock and roll, right, and it was connecting with a culture where we hadn't seen that kind of, I don't want to say darkness, but we hadn't seen that kind of realness in, right, rock and roll in a very, very long time. Yeah, and that's what made it so impactful.
Well, that's extremely perceptive, and you could almost trace it back to the 60s in some ways, it wasn't necessarily, Rage, could not have been more political. Pearl Jam, wasn't as politicized necessarily, but that realness that you're alluding to was also, I think, part of the transformation in terms of, that paramount, sort of iconic shifting moment in terms of, the Nirvanas and the Soundgardens and Alice in Chains and Jane's Addiction, even, bands like Stone Temple Pilots and it got people to look at music and culture from a different vantage point, and its importance has never really left, and I think it's informed so many generations going forward.
No, I believe it has, and I believe that its cultural impact has remained. The band has remained relevant. The impact, that album. Just be curious. I'm such a fan of that album. They remixed it. They remixed the album and put it out again, and I remember listening to that version.
Did you like the remix?
I did. Yeah. I did like it. I was so used to the original, though. I mean, there were slight things that were changed. But I just remember, I mean, that is an album to me that was seminal and it holds up. And to your point that you were speaking about with regards to the element of the cultural impact, the point that I thought was so significant is the cultural impact was there, but also it was there on a scale of sales, which is not even relevant to the point we're talking about, but that 10 million people bought that album says something about that album at that time and the impact in culture.
For sure.
Yeah, very much so.
Yeah, it wasn't, it wasn't a niche band.
No, no, exactly.
And some, and it was, I imagine if you spoke to them and asked them about it, I imagine that, it's probably super inspiring to know how many people probably grew up on that record and help them sort of form a voice, or get the confidence to sort of talk about things which weren't, love you songs, so.
Yeah, or sex, drugs, and rock and roll and party and good times. Yeah, precisely. Rage Against the Machine, the great quote that I took from this was one that you said.
You did great research because I was pretty hidden on that internet, so you must have gotten some good stuff. But thanks.
Yeah, I really wanted to prepare for this conversation because we've known each other for a long time, but I really, you've done some spectacular work, and I wanted it to be revealed in this. With Rage, you said the first time I saw them was in a rehearsal room in LA, and 20 seconds after they started playing, I was freaking out. So I ran to the door. I called Richard Griffiths in New York, and I said, "How soon can you get out here?" He ended up coming out pretty quickly, and we did the signing. It's super rewarding to see their relevance maintained. I guess my question is, do you still see or feel that bands can have that kind of power and relevance the way that we're talking about Pearl Jam, the way that Rage had that in that time? Do you still see that can happen today?
Well, I always want to believe that it can happen today, and I imagine that there are, generations of incredibly talented musicians, that have grown up with sort of their own influences. I don't want to go down a rabbit hole in terms of how, in some ways, how narrow the business was at that point, because we've reached a revolution where you don't need labels to go make records in your house, during a pandemic or not. You can literally just go make records, put them out yourself, and go build career, and that's the most inspiring thing to sort of be around and watch. It's hard because you don't want to ever be. Back in the days, you could have a Pearl Jam, or you could have a Bob Dylan, or a Springsteen, or, there's so much great artistry out there. I just, I think I think it's consumed in a different way, but I don't want to ever believe that there aren't, I could go off on a tangent on how many sort of impactful, artists there are in these current times, and, it translates in a different way. You look at someone like Chappell Roan and the voice to a generation and a voice to so many people. And it's just the nature of social media and communication now, maybe there's not as much mystery, or maybe the relationship is much more intimate with an artist and their audience. But, there's so much amazing music out there that I would never want to be in that mindset that music isn't transcending people in the same way. I just don't believe that.
Okay, it's.
Maybe I'm not answering your question.
No, not at all. You are. It's that you and I come from a time, and I was in that time working at labels where you're absolutely right. It just was a different era in that it was an era of scarcity compared to today. People like yourself, people like Richard Griffiths, Donnie Ienner, made the decision to sign an artist. There was a higher filter system, and it was much more limited.
Well, the power was reversed.
Exactly. The power was completely reversed. And as you pointed out, it was a smaller business, which is perhaps why I don't think, my question, I guess, that I have, and you've already answered it, is can artists have that kind of impact in the era today when we have so much choice. You know, you've just talked about how we have an era where we have endless choice today. You know, endless choice.
Well, I
we
imagine
didn't have that back.
No, it's different. But I think that you know, the relationship with you know, even in watching my daughter grow up, you know, she was the first kid on the block to listen to Lana Del Rey, and her classmates were like, "What is this?" I mean, my kid is a wonderful savant. You know, I never pushed her to go to be in have a musical sort of psyche, but she went back and you know, discovered the history of music in terms of the Simon and Garfunkels and Bob Dylan and Queen before there was a movie, and you know, she was had an insatiable appetite, you know, the Rolling Stones and Verve and Oasis, and you know, she just had an insatiable appetite. So she was a little bit of the, you know, first kid on the block in school, and so she gravitated to Lana and had that kind of relationship with Lana and the sentiments of what someone like Lana was speaking to, and a much more sort of you know, I think what I'm trying to poke at is in a much more insulated way, but no less impactful necessarily. So, you know, for her, if you asked her and she was sitting here, she'd say, you know, whether it was Lana Del Rey or Ethel Cain, those artists were as impactful in terms of her psyche as any of the things that we grew up with. It's just more of a different kind of a relationship, I think, with that artistry. You know, conversely, she probably listens to more music than I ever did or could have, but still has those things that are her compass, you know, and her conscience. You know, and I think that's the nuance that maybe you're poking at, because I want to believe that there are always going to be those artists that speak to someone's core or inform their psyche or help them, you know, think differently, dress differently, read differently. But they may listen to a lot of music that is much more of a casual relationship. And that's where the sort of the arc of consumption changes, because you can go grab anything and you can go listen to anything. And historically, you had to buy it. Now you can just stream it.
Yeah, and the access to it. I mean, we discovered all of that buying through radio, and we all listen to radio,
Sure.
Whether, you know, maybe not the same station, but we all listen to radio. Whereas now we all have 200, you know, different sources of how
Yeah.
we connect with music, whether it's social media or a friend or a referral. You know, I want to talk about you. You've reminded me of an interesting quote of yours that really picks up very much, I think, emotionally, and it shows your consciousness around this subject. You once said, in a very revealing reflection on that time that we're speaking of in your life and career when all of this was happening for you, those were some of my foundational experiences. The key was to take the value you got from those experiences, but not get stuck in them. And that's where being able to start Mom+Pop was so empowering to me, especially having very direct and transparent relationships in terms of creative controls, because I was gravitating toward artists who really did not need help making records, and learning that my value could be in helping them finish those records. Maybe it's a follow-up record, maybe it's the next record. And over time, it became valuable and wonderful, the diversity in what artists needed and didn't need. And I guess it's to me, that's like, I guess the essence to me of how your consciousness gave you or I should ask, was that the consciousness that gave you the confidence to start your own independent label in 2008?
Well, it's a little bit of what I was sort of speaking to at the beginning in terms of the empowerment around those artists. I mean, a lot of what informed Mom+Pop was ambition, aspiration, and survival in some ways. And I think that I was finding myself gravitating to music that probably wasn't valued in the same way that I was valuing it or experiencing it.
At that time?
Yeah, meaning that, to be blunt, could you just bring us another Rage Against the Machine? And the kind of artists that I was gravitating to, and even some of the stuff that I did at Warner's at Sire with Seymour was, Tegan and Sarah and Regina Spektor, who, at a different moment in time, maybe, probably, might not be perfectly suited for major labels. The level of impact and success wasn't substantial enough for the people that I worked for, but in the world that I went to, it was magnificent. Brett Gurewitz once said to me, you're doing some great things at Sire and you're signing some great things, but you'd be experiencing it completely differently if you were doing it on your own or if you were doing it, not in a corporation. And it just felt like I didn't want to be, I had worked so hard for so long that I did not want to be in a position to not be able to advocate and have more control over executing for artists. I'd rather, to be in a situation where I can sit with an artist in a room and make a promise and a commitment, and knowing that there's nobody else that I have to sort of go to, report to, defer to, is, that's empowering, to be able to sit there one-on-one with a musician and stand behind your, what you're saying that you're willing to do.
And in hearing that, I mean, I'm looking back on the beginning of Mom+Pop, it had to have been daunting for you in certain ways, because your career and your creative instincts had always been spot on. But now you're putting your creative instincts into an entity of your own where you have a lot more responsibility than just the creative aspects of making records. I imagine that must have been a huge learning curve for you, that aspect of it at that time.
It was, because, even in the sense of, building an infrastructure and a staff and a team. I mean, I went a lifetime before starting Mom+Pop without hiring anything other than an A&R person or two. And then all of a sudden I had to find marketing people, and I had to find, creative people and so many, that was actually harder than building the roster. But it was daunting, but it was also inspiring. I think I learned pretty quickly that the skill set of starting people in a 6-person label, at the time it was just 2 people, but in a 6-person label, hiring people off of resumes from major labels was not necessarily the best reference point for it. You wanted people that were more resourceful and entrepreneurial and weren't reliant on, where's the D2C department and where's the international department? And you had to be scrappy, and I learned a lot in that time of literally having to do it all by myself for a while.
Yeah.
So,
how was the label funded initially?
Initially, the label was funded by Q Prime. Q Prime, I'm sure you're familiar, is a powerful management company. Cliff Bernstein and Peter Mensch. I'd always had a relationship with them. I had taken a number of acts to them over the years. They said, we're managers, and you know how to build a label, or at least I don't say they knew that I knew how to build a label, but they knew that I had the the A&R acumen and experience to sort of be more likely to focus on how to build a label than how to go be a manager. We started the label for $300,000. They gave me the gift of infrastructure and a promotion department and an office, and we didn't have to. I didn't have to go find funding. I didn't have to find investors. I never could have done it had I had to sort of start that process over. I was really fortunate, and Peter and Cliff were incredible about sort of putting me in the position to actually hit the ground running. And to be able to go start that label for $300,000 and build it from there, might be one of the more underrated aspects of what we've been able to do.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's commendable. You're 17 years into it. You have one of the most respected independent labels. You have an incredible roster. one of the things that's known about Mom+Pop, which is really, I think, speaks highly to your leadership, is the fact that your team that runs the label with you, you have one of the lowest levels of turnover of any independent label in the business. And I'm curious, from your, how do you view leadership in this day and age now, based on what you've learned all these years of doing it, and in terms of how that has worked? What I mean, it's commendable.
No, I appreciate that, and we, we strive for that, and I think that not unlike developing an artist, sometimes, there's I think where there's a thread is, you kind of want to bring in people, before they're quite ready, in the same way that I was. So you bring in people that are, that live it, and you figure out a way, where I think we've been fortunate, and to speak to what you're talking about in terms of, longevity, is is trying to sort of thread that needle where you're constantly trying to either economically grow people, even if it's incrementally, year after year after year, and more importantly, in some ways, grow them in terms of their own empowerment, and to put them in positions where, that marketing person really does feel a level of control over that budget, and a level of participation in it, and a level of investment in it. It's an imperfect science. Sometimes you're hiring people into their first or second job, and it's a little different now than maybe it was even 10 or 12 years ago, and I can make the case either way. There's so much, there's a lot, there's a lot of businesses that have been, a lot of bigger companies have, have laid off a lot of people. But also sometimes you'll run into super talented people who are saying, okay, I want to now, go do this for myself, or go try something different. And so, sometimes you lose really great people, and you value the time that you have together, same as the artist. That's the biggest difference between an indie and a major. From my vantage point is, embrace the time that you have, not the time that you don't.
Okay.
Really important.
Speaking of what you just talked about, one of the things that really stood out to me on the creative side is that you've now started to sign major label acts. MGMT comes to mind. That is a major label act. What is it that you feel you can offer major label acts? Because that's not something that the trajectory in the past independent labels did.
Right.
And yet they chose to go with you, when I'm sure they could have gone with, a number of options. But what was it that you felt? Was it you? Was it the label? Was it the philosophy? Was it the plan? What was it that you offered?
Well, I mean, it's an interesting question, interesting perception. I think, there are a lot of artists along the way, even predating MGMT, that could have gone in either direction. Artists like Flume and Courtney Barnett, who had those kind of opportunities. And I think that, that there is an inherent difference in terms of, I think it does come back to that empowerment. I think the ease of doing business. An artist like MGMT, really specific vision, very, directed in what they wanted and what they didn't want. They were in a system that, because of the nature of, any kind of bigger company, there was, they were dealing with a lot of new people, over periods of time. And I think that they just wanted to be supported in some ways in the things that they didn't want to do. I think part of the reason that band came to work with us is because when they said, we have no intention of touring this record, we didn't flinch. And we thought about, credit to Thaddeus, thought about all the things that we could be doing without having a band that toured. And I think that they responded to that answer because they met with a lot of people. So we took the half full, here's everything we can do, not, we're limited by what you won't do.
You're 17 years now with Mom+Pop. You guys
I
celebrated.
keep saying 16, but I guess
16. Okay.
No, I'm sure you're right,
Yeah.
but it's funny.
Well, 2023 was the 15th anniversary.
Right.
So I
No,
say,
you're right.
yeah, it's 17 years with Mom+Pop, and the legacy that you and your team have created is substantial. And what do you hope will define its impact on the industry, both for artists and for independent labels?
I hope that it defines and inspires, all those sort of young entrepreneurs that are sometimes, boxed in bigger systems to sort of, sort of feel the confidence that great artistry and the support of that artistry can transcend. I mean, those independent companies were a compass for me. I could never have imagined, the people that, like Jonathan Poneman and Martin Mills, and people who sort of, didn't sort of say, hey, major label dude, trying to start an indie label, how pretentious. They were so pay it forward and so thoughtful and so giving that I would want for us and our company to, to go pay that forward to the next generation of people who want to go do that. And look, you want, the independent community to thrive. I was talking to Thaddeus this morning. We are a stronger independent company if all the independent companies are breaking artists, because then that question of, why should I sign to an indie versus a major gets a little bit watered down. So you want a healthy independent community that can function in a more boutique and thoughtful way. And the volume of a big company is, the ethos is different. So you hope for the health of it. You hope for the health and the next generation of people that want to go do it.
Yeah. And right now in this era, we're seeing that independent labels, those that are thriving, like Mom+Pop, are having not only lasting impact, but are growing in terms of their stature, are growing in terms of their impact. And you mentioned artists like, Courtney and Ash and others that are on your roster that have chosen to stay within that system rather than leave it, which I think speaks volumes to your point.
Well, that is, is sort of what I was alluding to earlier is, and on a sort of personal level, it's much more satisfying to be in a place where I can stay and if they want, they can leave, and having that kind of balance of power sort of shift to a place where, once again, you sort of celebrate the time and the music that you put out together, and that's where sort of appreciating those masters and those records and releases, not the one that you didn't get, or not the that third record that went somewhere else, So that's where, catalog and legacy and valuing what you have and not what you didn't get or what you don't hold on to. So it's a really sort of, important quality to strive for. And it doesn't always work out, The artists, we've done a pretty solid job of not historically, dropping only a handful of artists for reasons that, we're unavoidable, I guess, in some ways. But, it's one of the greatest values of, hey, let's, we've done it, with MGMT and with Courtney, we've gone a record at a time, it's something that has been of great value to us. So when you do get that endorsement of, more records over time, it's the greatest compliment that you can get, because they don't have to stay and they might be able to get more money somewhere else. So we could go down the rabbit hole in terms of the deals themselves, but we didn't touch on that. But at some point, I'd be happy to sort of share, some of that nuance around deals, because it's been really important for us to sort of stick to those clean 50-50s, and every dollar of streaming, having half of it go to the artist and half of it go to us without a lot of hubbub around it and hidden costs has been, also super valuable.
Absolutely, and you have my commitment. I would love to have you on as a guest on our podcast, where we really can go much deeper into these kinds of things. Michael, we cannot thank you enough for taking the time to come do this. This has been a real joy and a pleasure. I appreciate it immensely.
Thank you. I mean, I appreciate, getting the perspective, and having to come to a current moment. It's been super helpful and super rewarding to chat.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Yeah, of course.